I just finished taking a course that Keith Wolf is developing on statistics for appraisers, and in that class, he did some discussion on hypothesis testing. And what that looks like is creating what's called a null hypothesis. That's sort of your starting assumption, and it would be that there's maybe considering a couple of variables. Is there a relationship? And maybe your null hypothesis might be that no, there's no relationship. And the alternative hypothesis is that yes, there is some sort of relationship, and those can be defined more specifically. But that's generally the way that uh, we're considering just these two choices. Okay, do we have a starting assumption, and can we test that and possibly reject that with an alternative? And I began to think about that in terms of market conditions analysis. I've been talking a lot just in the last couple of weeks about major home price indices, and I know that there is sort of a narrative out there, particularly with the GSEs, saying, hey, at least look at a home price index. They're out there. You know, is that better than nothing? And I've pushed back on that. Is it better than nothing? Well, if you're just using that and nothing else, it could be worse than nothing. But I think the when I considered this concept that we're looking at and applied it to the consideration of what do you do with home price index data. I'm speaking about broad ones, your Case-Shiller, your Zillow, Freddie Mac's got their own, and there are others. So what do you do with that data? And I think uh, what the GSEs may be observing is that if we use this language, appraisers by and large are starting with the null hypothesis that there has not been market change, and the alternative hypothesis that there has been market change. There isn't always a lot of effort to actually test that hypothesis. And so the idea is, hey, well, here's at least one piece of evidence that home prices do change. And I think when we step back, um, if that's always your null hypothesis, your starting assumption that there has been no market change, that might not always be the best starting assumption. And I think if we look at a long enough span of time, I think we'd all agree, let's consider 5 years. Whatever market, whatever type of property you're dealing with, if you go back 5 years, I think you're probably going to say that prices now are different than they were in your market 5 years ago. I think that's a pretty safe assumption. If for no other reason than inflation alone. What a dollar buys now is not the same as what a dollar bought 5 years ago. And so if that's the case, if we can look back and say, hey, well, yeah, markets do change, prices change. What a home cost in my market right now differs vastly from 5 years ago. So prices do change over time, markets change. So maybe my null hypothesis of prices don't change isn't necessarily the best one. Now, that does involve some alternate assumptions. Well, if I'm going to assume that markets change, how do I make that assumption? What's my starting assumption there? And so that gets a little bit more difficult when you look at this sort of simplistic black and white null hypothesis versus alternate hypothesis situation. But the concept remains that perhaps if we think of our starting point as being prices do change, and so what I'm looking for is perhaps uh, data that might challenge that assumption. Maybe the that null hypothesis of markets do change is in fact rejected by the data. It within the time frame I'm looking at, all my comps are within maybe the last 4 months. maybe the data shows that there hasn't been market change during that time frame. So given the time frame of 4 months, data suggests that I reject my null hypothesis of market change in favor of an alternative hypothesis of a stable pricing when we're talking about that time period. That's a way of thinking about it. And in terms of those broad indices, I think GSEs are looking at those and saying, hey, I'm seeing prices change. There's a lot of data showing that prices change. Why do I always see, or not always, but in a vast majority of times, I see appraisals that don't recognize market change? And I understand that frustration, but uh, so this might be a way of conceptualizing sort of their perspective, what they're seeing, and maybe providing a little bit of challenge for us as appraisers to challenge our own assumptions. Um, do I stick with my assumption of no price change and not really look at all the data that's out there that might challenge that assumption? So all this to say, this is just a different way that I thought of this morning of conceptualizing what's going on with the GSEs, them talking about home price indices, and how to consider them, how to use them. Again, take this bit of information in the context of everything else that I've talked about. I definitely don't think that a broad home price index by itself is ever going to be enough to reject a hypothesis. That's not going to be enough data by itself. But could it be a piece of the puzzle that might have some value? Perhaps. So again, there's more information out there. Just wanted to focus on this sort of statistics definition here of null versus alternative hypothesis, and consider how that might impact how we look at market change.